Welcome to MacGyver's Workshop, where you never know what we're going to be working on next. If you're not too careful, you just might learn something. Hi there. Welcome to another episode of MacGyver's Workshop, where you never know what we're going to be working on next, and if you're not too careful, you just might learn something. So, today what we're working on is a 2012 Hyundai Sonata, and it is in dire need of a passenger side front wheel bearing. So we're going to get started. Now today we're going to have to do this one on the ground because I've got my lift tied up by a big old honking truck. We're waiting on some parts. But that's okay because not everybody has a lift in their shop. Now to begin, you want to make sure, of course, that you jack the car properly. Right up here behind the front wheel is the proper lift point for this car. You don't want to damage any of the the plastic trim and side skirting and all that good stuff. Alright, now sometimes if you're lucky you can get the caliper bracket bolts loose and take the caliper and the bracket off all in one shot. In this case here, these things are on pretty darn tight, so I don't have access to get to them with something with enough leverage. So we're going to go ahead and remove the caliper first and get it out of the way, so then we can get the get to those bolts on that caliper bracket. And to do that, you'll need a 14mm bolt to get the slider bolts off these calipers, and get those fellows out of there, and you should be able to just rock the caliper back and forth to loosen it up, and then set it back off to the side. I usually set it back on the sway bar back there because you don't want to hang the weight on the brake hose. Get a little more leverage with this breaker bar. There we go. As Archimedes said, give me a long enough lever and I can move the world. Now we got that one broken loose. Get our other one. I'm sure it's going to fight just as hard. These fellows are in here pretty darn tight, so. And of course, be mindful of any of the anti-squealy pads that are stuck to the brake pads. Well, I usually end up just disassembling the whole thing and being done with it. But alright, now we want to get our brake rotor off. You've got these two little Phillips head screws. You want to use an impact driver, otherwise you will just merely strip these screws out and then you'll be fighting trying to get them extract them. That shocks them loose. Oh, this one's already loose. Okay. Now this did just have some major work done to it recently. This had one of those things where the engine blows up from lack of oil pressure, and Hyundai replaced the engine. The owner swears up and down that the wheel bearing was damaged in the process of them pulling the engine out, which is entirely possible because you do have to take these axle shafts out, and if perhaps they didn't, maybe they over torqued this nut, which tightened the bearing up too much. That may have had a part in it. We don't know, but once we get it apart, we'll find out. So, and we will, since I'm in here, we'll go ahead and pull this cotter pin out of here. Get that out. And then we'll find a socket to fit that, but in the meantime, I have to just get our tie rod end off of here, because we are going to need to have our tie rod removed. And of course that flew off into a parallel dimension, so we'll have to replace that with a new cotter key, which is no major big deal. Let's see what we got here. This is a 14 millimeter on the tie rod end. Let me bring the camera over here so you can see. This is a tie rod end. There's your CV axle, and it comes through and gets tightened down with that big nut right there. Now we'll go ahead and get our nut loose on here. And then usually just a good smack with a hammer right about here will knock that loose. You don't ever really want to hammer on here if you can help it. They make tools for this too, pullers and all that, but usually just a good whack with a hammer will get it. Now that is all free from it's all free from there, and our hub is free. So let me go find a socket for this and we'll be right back. Alright, we'll go ahead and get this off. And you have a washer. It's kind of rounded on one side, so you want to make sure you have it, you know, in the right orientation when you go back with it. And you'll have to probably fight this a little bit to get it out, but that's okay. We'll deal with that in a minute. Next thing we got to do is use a 10 millimeter socket and get this wheel speed sensor out of here. Just be very gentle. Working on out of there. Okay, so it took a little bit of work to get this wheel speed sensor loose out of here, and it's plastic, so you have to be very, very careful. But this is a reason why I don't particularly care for Korean cars at this point. They have come a long way, and they are getting better, but to manufacture these cars to a price point, they're, in my opinion, and that's, I stress my opinion because I'm not a metallurgist, I'm not, you know, an expert engineer or anything like that, but I believe that the quality of the metal that they use when they make the various parts and assemblies is subpar compared to other brands, because at least in regards to corrosion, because everything just gets corroded and it fights you, and whereas if you work on, you know, a Toyota or a Mercedes or something like that, you know, your parts come apart easy. You know, as long as the car didn't live way up north where they salt the roads, you know, then, you know, everything should come apart nicely and without a bunch of fuss. And this is just, this car, everything fights you the whole way. So There's also an awful lot of rust from that corrosion that's gotten all over the wheel speed sensor. So if she's not had any funky warnings from her ABS or traction control, I'm sure she would have eventually. So we're going to clean all that nastiness off, because this does have a magnet in it. So if there's any kind of, you know, any kind of trash stuck to it, then it'll throw that sensor off, and it will stick to it because it's a magnet. So, all right, the next thing we got to do is we need to get our bottom ball joint loose and our top two strut bolts loose to get this hub off of the vehicle. What we'll do next is go ahead and get this lower ball joint nut and bolt out of here. This one's kind of different from your typical lower ball joint, which has a tapered seat that wedges in there, and then kind of like that tie rod end, you have to smack the housing with a hammer to get it to pop loose. But this is actually a little better. The shaft of the ball joint has a groove cut in it, and then when you put the bolt in through, it holds the ball joint in place. So, and the way the sway bar is set up on this, it puts it under a load, so that's why it's springy like that. And we'll go ahead and see if we can get this loose without having to hold it on the other end. There we go. That came out rather nicely. And then what we can do is we can put a chisel in here. There's a little split in this housing here, and spread it just a tiny bit to allow us to let that thing pop out nice and free. And this is just another example of that I was telling you about with the metal. This bolt was frozen. This bolt was frozen in here, and is requiring a lot of persuasion to get it out because of the buildup of corrosion. Now, if we lived in upstate New York or Chicago or something like that, you know, where you got harsh winters and they salt the roads all the time, I could see that possibly. But this is a southern car, hasn't seen any flooding, hasn't seen any harsh winters or anything like that. But you know, you just got corrosion buildup in here, and that shouldn't happen. It doesn't happen on other better quality cars. And I hate to say it, and I don't like to badmouth anybody's vehicle, but you know, just, and I'm the friend who owns this car will say herself in a minute, you know, she'd never buy another one of these. But there's just so much better out there than this. They look good and they're cheap, and then that entices you to buy them. But you know, anytime any maintenance needs to be done on them, it's just a nightmare. Alrighty, now that we got our lower ball joint bolt out, and I've got it held spread just a tiny bit with the chisel down in that gap there. Now we'll go ahead and undo these top two nuts here. This is going to be a 24 millimeter. And I'm going to go ahead and take this bracket out of the way, because it is just annoying. I'm going to guess that's a 12 millimeter. And of course, due to its inherent corrosion, it's going to be stiff the majority of the way out. There, that'll get that out of the way so we can get at this bottom bolt. or nut, excuse me. You may have to hold it on the back side with something. Yep. Yeah, we'll have to grab it. Something on the other side here. Let's see what we need. That's going to be a 19 millimeter. Probably just hold it. Now we'll pop this out of the strut here. Alright, pure and simple. Corrosion. Made this thing just fight the whole way out. So now that we've got our hub free here, you hear how ugly that sounds. We'll get over to the bench here and start working on getting this hub and bearing out.